10 miles south of Croydon, below the M25, sits the East Surrey village of Limpsfield. It is renowned for its well-preserved domestic architecture, including medieval hall houses. I'm Nicholas Dixon, and I work as a professional genealogist and house historian. During the last 2 years, I've been researching a house in Limpsfield and the land on which it stands. In the process, I have gained valuable insights into how the village looked in previous eras. The parish church of St Peter's Limpsfield dates from the 12th century. From the medieval period to the 19th century, the rector of the church had the right to collect tithes from the inhabitants, which means that a tenth of the produce in their farmland and gardens went to him. But in the 1830s, tithes were replaced by a fixed charge calculated from the value of the produce. In order to work out who was liable to pay this charge, surveyors were sent to map most rural communities in England and Wales, including Limpsfield. However, the Limpsfield map has a number of gaps. It only tells part of the story. By looking at the tithe file for Limpsfield in the National Archives, I was able to find out that the gaps are due to the rector of the time, Robert Main. He decided not to collect tithes from the cottage gardens in the village, sparing the less wealthy inhabitants a burdensome obligation. As a result, labourers were exempted from the charge that replaced the tithes. This means that the dwellings of the poorer inhabitants in the village are absent from the tithe map of Limpsfield, made in 1841. From my research, I have been able to discover what was in some of the gaps. I've used deeds in the Surrey History Centre, the 1841 census, taxation records, and other maps from the 19th century. One conspicuous gap on the tithe map is the site of the Bull Inn, a pub in the village's high street that was adjacent to the plot numbered 171. The pub was surrounded by a farmyard and copyhold land that was held of the lord of the manor. The farmyard is shown next to the pub on a map of 1840. The 1841 census shows that Stephen Jenner was its publican at that time. He lived with his family, 2 servants, an agricultural labourer, a man of independent means, and 2 journeyman painters. South of the Bull was the lodge to Hookwood, a small stately home sold by Vincent Hilton Biscoe to William Lewson Gore of nearby Titsey Place in 1840. The map from that year, which is a plan of the Hookwood estate, shows a carriage drive leading to the house that survives as a narrow road next to the former lodge. Further to the south was a carpenter's and bricklayer's yard, now an undertaker's. The carpenter's yard is marked on the Hookwood estate map of 1840. This was leased with 2 cottages to Robert Belchambers, a carpenter of the nearby town of Westerham, and inhabited in 1841 by a bricklayer, John Bellingham, with his family. They are shown in the census returns. The tithe map only shows a garden belonging to Belchambers, which is the plot numbered 822. Below the carpenter's yard was a house that belonged to the Cockett family in the 18th century. The land tax records show that they sold it to Edward Atkinson, a grocer who added a shop, in the 1820s. According to a newspaper obituary, It was later owned by Atkinson's former shop assistant, George Wickham, whose name can still be seen on the property's shopfront today. The adjoining house has been divided in three. The 1841 census shows Isaac Atkinson, a grocer here, with an apprentice, George Farley, and Rebecca Burnett, a domestic servant. Further south were 6 cottages that belonged to Simon Baker, a clockmaker, and his wife Mary. In 1841, Baker had recently added 1 cottage to the north and 3 cottages to the south of 2 existing dwellings. One of the cottages was inhabited by Richard Ridley, a journeyman shoemaker and parish clerk, whose garden is on the tithe map, numbered 823. He is in the 1841 census, with his wife and son. There was also stabling for John Constable, Limpsfield's carrier, attached to this plot. He was shown in the census, with his wife and 2 children. Beyond the 6 cottages was an ancient thatched barn, used by a wheelwright, George Godfrey. It is shown in a photograph taken before its demolition in 1927. Godfrey is shown living with his mother in the 1841 census in the adjoining cottage. Next to them were 3 cottages inhabited by the families of William Lucas, a shoemaker, William Ridley, a journeyman carpenter, and Mary West, a blacksmith's widow. They were next to the Rodney Inn, whose publican was William Morris. The inn is shown on the tithe map, and is numbered 821. Completing the ensemble at the southern end of the village were the cottages opposite, which adjoined a forge formerly used by the Wests. These cottages occupied a triangular plot that had formerly been manorial wasteland. The 1841 census shows Thomas Adams, a blacksmith, living there with his wife and 3 children. The striking facade of one of the cottages, with a pediment, had been added in the 1830s. This cottage's inhabitants in 1841 seem to have been 2 women of independent means, Anne Luckin and Anne Steer. Behind the forge and the adjoining cottages was the Furze Field, a part of the rector's glebe-land. It was known as Priest Hill, and marked 144 on the tithe map. Thank you for watching this brief talk. I hope that I have given you an insight into what Limpsfield was like in 1841, and shown that by filling the gaps in a tithe map using other sources, we can gain a more detailed picture of village life in the 19th century. By analysing deeds, taxation records and census records, we can reconstruct the forgotten parts of a village's history and begin to understand how the different pieces of land have changed over time. This process is obviously useful for house history and local history, but also for genealogy. If we can place people in relation to their neighbours, we can better understand their lives. Please feel free to contact me via my website if you have any questions.